Okay everyone, welcome. Tonight we're diving headfirst into the Middle Ages, that incredible thousand-year period where folks sincerely believed that diseases were caused by demons, cats were secret agents, and the solution to pretty much any ailment involved either fervent prayer or setting something ablaze. So, before you get too comfy, please take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. But only if you truly enjoy the content I'm putting out here. And be sure to drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always so cool to see who's joining in from all corners of the globe. Now, let's dim those lights, maybe switch on a fan to get that nice ambient background noise going, and let's gently ease our way into tonight's journey together. It all kicked off in July of 1518 when a woman by the name of Frau Trophia casually strolled into the streets of Strasbourg and just started dancing. No music playing, no audience gathered, really no apparent reason whatsoever. Just a solo, impromptu rave right smack in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire. Initially, people just figured she'd lost a bet or maybe just completely lost her mind. But when she kept dancing relentlessly for days on end, her neighbors began to realize that something far, far worse was actually unfolding before their very eyes. Exercise. Before long, dozens of others joined in, moving as if they were absolutely possessed by some unseen force, twitching erratically, stomping their feet, collapsing to the ground, and, on occasion, even dying right there in mid-step. Contemporary accounts at the time claimed that as many as 400 individuals were dancing totally uncontrollably. Because medieval Europe just couldn't catch a break with a nice, peaceful summer, it had to play host to what was essentially the first recorded silent disco of doom. Naturally, the local authorities decided to help by doing something monumentally stupid. Instead of maybe quarantining the dancers or even, I don't know, asking why everyone was suddenly convulsing, they went ahead and built a stage and hired musicians. Yes, they actually turned mass hysteria into a full-blown civic festival. It was pretty much the only time in recorded history where more cowbell was genuinely a fatal recommendation. Theories as to why this happened vary widely. Some people blame ergot poisoning, which is caused by a hallucinogenic fungus that grows on rye bread. In simpler terms, the entire town accidentally microdosed on LSD. Others have suggested that it was a case of mass psychogenic illness, which basically means that everyone collectively lost their marbles together. Medieval Europe's favorite group activity. Doctors, of course, blamed it all on hot blood. So, their ingenious solution? Make the dancers keep dancing to sweat it all out. Because nothing quite cures utter exhaustion like even more exhaustion. Meanwhile, the local priests claimed that the townsfolk had somehow offended Saint Vitus, who was the patron saint of dancing, and had thus sentenced them to a reluctant pilgrimage to his shrine. Just imagine crawling for miles on end with blisters, suffering from delirium, and wearing what were essentially 16th century shoes. Holiness was entirely optional, but misery was absolutely mandatory. Eventually, the dancers collapsed, the music finally stopped, and Strasbourg went right back to normal, which, remember, in the 1500s still meant dealing with plague, famine, and terrible dental hygiene. But the legend of the dancing plague stuck around. Historians today refer to it as mass hysteria, although it's honestly hard to say what's crazier, people dancing themselves to death or their government doubling down by providing live entertainment. And that, my friends, is how the Middle Ages inadvertently invented both rave culture and public health failure. In the very same week, back in 897 AD, the Catholic Church decided to take drama to a whole new level, a level usually reserved for truly terrible reality TV. It all began when Pope Stephen VI decided that simply disliking his predecessor just wasn't enough. He felt compelled to actually prosecute his corpse. Yes, you heard that correctly. The late Pope Formosus had been dead for around 9 months when Stephen ordered his body dug up, dressed in full papal robes, and dragged into court. This bizarre event became known as the Cadaver Synod, or, as it probably should have been called, Keeping Up with the Popes, Exhumed Edition. The trial commenced with the deceased Formosus sitting upright on a throne, his skeletal remains wobbling precariously under the weight of his extravagant vestments. A deacon was appointed to speak on behalf of the defendant, which seemed somewhat unnecessary considering the defendant's tongue had decayed a good 6 months prior. Witnesses gasped in horror as Stephen screamed accusations at the corpse, accusations of perjury, unbridled ambition, and the ultimate mortal sin of existing before Stephen himself did. The outcome, of course, was predetermined from the very start. Formosus was found guilty on all counts. His papal garments were violently ripped off, his blessing fingers were ceremoniously cut off, as if he might still somehow try to bless someone, and his corpse was tossed unceremoniously into the Tiber River. For a fleeting moment, Stephen must have felt utterly triumphant, until everyone else realized that their pope had just publicly bullied a corpse. Riots immediately broke out in the streets. The clergy themselves called it an utter embarrassment. The people simply called it Tuesday. Eventually, Stephen himself was imprisoned and subsequently strangled to death in his cell, presumably by someone who strongly preferred their popes to be alive. The whole absurd episode revealed what medieval politics were truly all about: personal grudges, overly dramatic theatrics, and absolutely zero adult supervision. Historians have since suggested that the Cadaver Synod was actually fueled by power struggles between rival factions within the church. But honestly, it reads more like one man's descent into divine madness. It's undeniable proof that even in the age of faith, humans were still petty, unbelievably bored, and disturbingly creative. So, the next time you encounter some workplace drama, just take comfort in the fact that at least your boss isn't exhuming former employees just to yell at them. In the end, Pope Formosus was quietly reburied and officially revered by later popes, proving that even within the church, bad management decisions will eventually get reversed. Medieval rumor had it that when powerful churchmen died, their bodies sometimes had a tendency to explode. Most people dismissed this as just tavern talk, the kind of story you tell after your third ale. Unfortunately for William of Ware, the Bishop of Winchester, and later for Henry of Blois, his illustrious predecessor, history suggests that there may have been a literal bang behind the bizarre legend. Here's the basic setup. Back in the 12th century, embalming wasn't exactly an exact science. You drained a little bit of blood, sprinkled some herbs, maybe waved a Bible at the corpse for good measure, and then basically just hoped for the best possible outcome. Then, you sealed the body in a lead coffin underneath a scorching hot stone cathedral where any kind of air circulation was pretty much a myth. A few weeks later, nature would inevitably come calling, and loudly at that. Chroniclers at the time recorded that one of the bishops of Winchester was laid to rest in the sweltering heat of midsummer, and within a matter of days, his tomb began to groan ominously. Monks claimed it was his soul finally escaping purgatory. More likely, it was just methane escaping from absolutely everywhere else. When the lid of the coffin finally cracked, the stench was so incredibly overpowering that several witnesses fell to their knees and repented, not out of genuine faith, but simply from sheer nausea. Word quickly spread that the bishop had actually burst due to his numerous sins. Pilgrims flocked to the site to pray over the bizarre miracle. Priests, of course, never once to miss a good branding opportunity, started calling it divine punishment for greed. The cathedral quietly replaced the damaged tiles, and no one ever really talked about it again, except for every gossip within a 200-mile radius. Forensic historians now believe that the legend actually originated from real accidents that occurred during medieval burials. Corpses that were sealed too tightly would swell up with gases until the coffin inevitably split open or even exploded. The church, naturally, spun this into a theological lesson, a convenient warning against pride, gluttony, and the dangers of eating salted meat in the middle of July. It's a perfect snapshot of medieval logic. Something disgusting happens, everyone panics, and the ultimate explanation somehow involves God's deeply held opinions on dinner portion sizes. Modern scientists call it decomposition. Medieval chroniclers called it the wrath of heaven. Either way, the end result was ultimately the same, an unforgettable reminder that even the holiest among us are just one bad summer away from becoming a cautionary tale. In an age where the vast majority of people couldn't read, but absolutely everyone could panic, few rumors spread faster than the idea that the Holy Communion wafers, those little discs of sanctified bread, were spontaneously bleeding. Yes, bleeding. According to the faithful, these weren't simply symbolic morsels, they were quite literally slices of Christ himself, and they occasionally bled to prove it. The very first reports of this phenomenon began popping up across Europe sometime during the 12th and 13th centuries. A priest would accidentally drop a wafer, or maybe stab it with a knife, presumably by accident, and it would almost immediately start oozing red. Instead of asking the rather obvious question, "Is it at all possible that I've just cut my finger?" the clergy swiftly concluded that it was a miracle. Because in medieval logic, anything that wasn't immediately explainable was deemed either divine or demonic, with very little room for anything in between. One particularly famous case occurred in Bolsena, Italy, around 1263, when a priest who was privately doubting the doctrine of transubstantiation, the idea that the bread literally transforms into Christ's body, saw his wafer bleed onto the altar cloth right in the middle of Mass. His disbelief almost immediately turned into sheer terror, as it usually does when your lunch starts hemorrhaging all over the place. The cloth was quickly rushed to Pope Urban IV, who promptly declared it a full-blown miracle. He even commissioned the construction of Orvieto Cathedral to commemorate the momentous occasion. It's still there to this very day, part basilica, part bloodstained souvenir shop. Of course, centuries later, science had the sheer audacity to ruin everything for everyone. Microbiologists discovered a cheerfully red bacterium called Serratia marcescens. It thrives on moist bread and produces a distinctive red pigment. Translation: the blood of Christ was actually just an enthusiastic case of food poisoning. But back in the Middle Ages, no one really wanted to hear that particular explanation. Bleeding wafers drew massive crowds. Pilgrims came from far and wide to witness the spectacle, toss coins into the collection plate, and hopefully leave with some holy crumbs. The original miracle merch. The church really leaned into the whole thing. Every oozing wafer was just further evidence that faith truly worked, even if biology was quietly disagreeing in the corner. So yes, the legend of the bleeding bread turned out to be technically true, just not exactly the kind of truth that the clergy had hoped for. It wasn't undeniable proof of God's mysterious ways. It was simply proof that refrigeration had yet to be invented. If divine intervention smells slightly sour and grows in damp cupboards, maybe holiness just needs better storage conditions. Within the Grand Museum of Medieval Nightmares, few exhibits are quite as upsetting or as weirdly specific as the dreaded Rat King, a tangled mass of unfortunate rats whose tails have somehow fused together, forcing them to move as one horrifying, squeaking organism. The people of Lübeck, a proud German trading city, swore that they had actually seen these rat kings during outbreaks of the plague. The rats would reportedly appear all tangled together and shrieking in terror, dragging each other across the floor like some kind of furry hydra of disease. Scholars, for the most part, dismissed it as mere tavern gossip. After all, medieval Europe already had more than enough horrors to deal with without inventing entirely new ones. But as it turns out, the legend was actually disgustingly true. In 1828, long after the end of the Middle Ages, a farmer near Beam discovered an actual rat king, consisting of 32 rodents whose tails were fused together by hardened dirt, blood, and various bodily fluids. They were carefully preserved and put on display in the Museum of Natural History in Altenburg, where they still remain to this very day, presumably plotting their inevitable revenge. So yes, the medieval peasants weren't simply imagining things. They were just collectively having the absolute worst week imaginable. Modern science explains that rat kings happen when young rats are trapped in a nest coated with sticky substances, such as sap, excrement, or freezing mud, causing their tails to become entangled. As they grow, the tangled tails tighten, their bones eventually fuse together, and nature quietly gives up on any kind of quality control. It's essentially the rodent equivalent of a group chat that you can never leave. To medieval minds, though, this was no mere accident. It was an ominous omen, a living symbol of plague and unrepentant sin. If you happened to see a rat king, it meant that God was incredibly angry, the devil was having a good laugh, and you should probably just start digging your own grave to save yourself some valuable time. Chroniclers at the time even described entire towns burning their cellars to the ground in a desperate attempt to purge the wrath of vermin. Historians today love to scoff at such rampant superstition, but really, who wouldn't panic if 30 rats walked by all knotted together like some kind of grotesque parade float of disease? The legend, disturbingly, wasn't actually exaggerated all that much. The peasants really did see a writhing mass of rats all knotted together by fate, and then, the very next day, half the town would be coughing up blood. Sometimes folklore really doesn't lie. It just tends to leave out the smell. If you ever happen to find yourself in Wales and you see a sign pointing to a holy well, you might reasonably assume that it's just another quaint village with an overachieving church. But this particular well definitely earned its holy name the hard way, by quite literally sprouting from the spot where a saint was decapitated. The story dates all the way back to the 7th century when a nobleman by the name of Caradoc developed an intense crush on a pious young woman named Winifred. She, understandably, wasn't particularly interested in him, probably because she had standards, and she fled towards a chapel where her uncle, Saint Buno, was busy praying. Caradoc, demonstrating medieval courtship at its finest, responded by chopping off her head. Immediately, a spring burst forth from the ground where her head had fallen, turning an unspeakable tragedy into a potential tourist attraction. Buno, apparently completely unfazed by the beheading, casually picked up her head, stuck it right back on her neck, and performed a miracle-level CPR. Winifred miraculously survived long enough to become a nun, a revered saint, and the patron saint of people who've objectively had a worse day than you. Over the centuries, the spring at Holywell became one of Britain's most visited pilgrimage sites. It was even nicknamed the Lord of Wales. Kings, commoners, and the occasional irredeemable sinner dipped themselves in its icy waters, hoping to find healing. Chroniclers at the time claimed that it could cure blindness, paralysis, and even bad marriages. Modern science might simply call that the placebo effect, but medieval folks called it hope. Then came the Reformation, when every miracle was suddenly viewed with intense suspicion as being suspiciously Catholic. Reformers tried desperately to close the shrine, drain the well, and completely debunk the legend, only for the spring to just keep gushing defiantly, as if God himself was refusing to be audited. Pilgrims continued to sneak back under the cover of darkness, dunking themselves in the well like holy rebels. Today, the well still flows freely, a bubbling relic of superstition and human survival. Scientists have tested the water and have discovered that it's rich in minerals, iron, and trace elements that could technically promote healing. Which basically means that everyone's been arguing for a good 1,300 years about whether it's a genuine divine miracle or just really good geology. Either way, St. Winifred definitely got the last laugh. Her legend has somehow turned a gruesome murder into a national spa day, and her well continues to draw believers, skeptics, and people who just enjoy a good soak in some refreshingly cold water. The moral of the story: never underestimate a woman with unwavering faith, strong family connections, and a naturally pressurized spring on her side. If you ever feel like your workplace drama is unbearable, just remember the Knights Templar, the only organization in all of recorded history that somehow managed to go from being the heroic saviors of the Crusades to heretics burning at the stake in under a century. The Templars initially began as holy warriors who were sworn to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land. Over time, they evolved into the medieval version of a multinational bank, loaning vast sums of money to kings, constructing impressive fortresses, and inventing the very concept of interest rates, which everyone absolutely loved right up until the moment they owed the Templars money. By the early 1300s, they possessed incredible wealth, unmatched influence, and undeniably stylish matching outfits, three things that were pretty much guaranteed to make any monarch feel deeply insecure. Enter King Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, a man so incredibly broke that he once pawned his own crown, and so unbelievably petty that he makes modern politicians look like benevolent philosophers. He owed the Templars a small fortune and decided that actually paying them back would be decidedly unchristian. Arresting them, torturing them, and stealing everything they owned, however, was apparently perfectly Christian. So, in 1307, Philip ordered every single Templar in France to be arrested on the exact same day, a move that can only be accurately described as the original Friday the 13th disaster. The charges against them were heresy, idol worship, and, of course, kissing each other's feet. You know, just your typical medieval HR complaints. The imprisoned knights, under extreme duress, confessed to absolutely everything, mainly because medieval interrogation techniques involved hot irons and precisely zero anesthesia. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was eventually burned at the stake in Paris in 1314. And this is where the legend truly ignites. According to witnesses, as the flames rose higher, de Molay cursed both the king and the pope, summoning them to meet him before God within the coming year. It sounds undeniably theatrical, until you realize that both men actually died within that very time frame. Philip's death was particularly embarrassing, as he was thrown from his horse during a hunt, proving that even French royalty couldn't outmaneuver gravity. The church tried its best to bury the whole incident and everything else along with it, but the damage had already been done. All across Europe, people whispered that the Templars' vengeance had begun, and that their curse would linger for generations to come. Some even linked it to the eventual downfall of the French monarchy centuries later, poetic justice unfolding in incredibly slow motion. Whether you choose to call it divine retribution or simply pure coincidence, the story stuck. The Templars may have gone up in flames, but their enduring reputation simply refused to burn out. The moral of the story is to never cross a man who possesses a sword, a deeply held grudge, and a flair for dramatic last words. The Black Death swept relentlessly through Europe in the 14th century, killing so many people that God himself started getting some seriously negative performance reviews. Amidst the utter chaos appeared one of history's most unsettling fashion icons, the infamous plague doctor, with his long leather coat, wide-brimmed hat, and a beaked mask that made him look like some kind of demonic stork who had unceremoniously quit his mid-career. The bizarre outfit was specifically designed to protect the doctors from miasma, the foul-smelling bad air that everyone at the time blamed for the rapid spread of disease. Germ theory wouldn't actually exist for another 500 years, so if something smelled truly awful, it was obviously death itself just casually floating by. The iconic beak was usually stuffed with a combination of herbs, various spices, and sometimes even vinegar-soaked cloth in order to purify the air. Basically medieval aromatherapy with a side of abject anxiety. The overall result was a physician who looked like he had just wandered straight out of a truly terrible nightmare with a bag full of screams. The long coat was meticulously waxed to resist infection, the gloves were sealed tightly, and a long staff was used to poke and prod patients from a safe distance because nothing says bedside manner quite like treating your patients with the same stick you use on stray dogs. Ironically, the vast majority of plague doctors were actually not trained physicians at all. Many were just random volunteers or barber surgeons looking to make a little extra income while maintaining minimal proximity to the sick. Cities often hired them when everyone else had either already died or fled in terror. Their job description was relatively simple: meticulously record deaths, lance buboes, and try not to faint. They were paid handsomely, although their contract often included clauses explicitly stating no touching, no quitting, and absolutely no suing God. And while the overall look certainly became legendary, the results were definitely mixed. The waxed leather coat helped a little. The iconic mask really didn't help at all. Plague doctors still managed to contract the disease with impressive efficiency, proving that high fashion can't always save you from the brutal realities of biology. But the enduring image stuck around, a terrifying symbol of survival, science, and utter confusion. When modern historians first stumbled upon descriptions of the plague doctor's elaborate costume, they initially assumed it was just a myth, until preserved examples turned up in archives, and numerous paintings confirmed the absolute horror. Medieval Europe really did put its unwavering faith in a man who looked like a crow auditioning for a Greek tragedy. So yes, the enduring legend was undeniably true. The plague doctors weren't exactly angels of mercy. They were essentially the Middle Ages' somewhat misguided answer to the troubling question, what if your worst nightmare had a clipboard? And frankly, given the absolutely abysmal state of public health at the time, it was probably an improvement. Long before the advent of ghost hunting TV shows and advanced night vision cameras, the Welsh countryside already possessed its own unique brand of supernatural tourism centered around the eerie corpse lights. People in medieval Wales swore that they frequently saw glowing orbs floating eerily above roads and graveyards, drifting silently through the night like ethereal lanterns carried by invisible hands. They weren't just spooky, they were often considered to be strangely prophetic. According to local lore, if you happened to see a corpse light, it meant that someone nearby was on the verge of dying, nothing quite like a floating pre-death notification to really spice up your evening walk. The ominous lights were said to vary in size, smaller ones for infants, larger ones for adults, because even the paranormal world seemingly respected medieval demographics. Witnesses often described them weaving along familiar paths that later became funeral routes, hovering momentarily over streams before inexplicably disappearing. To the villagers, this was solid, undeniable evidence of divine involvement. To modern scientists, it was likely more a case of flammable gas plus inclement weather. You see, in the centuries before chemistry was even a thing, people simply had no idea that decomposing organic matter releases phosphine and methane, which can spontaneously ignite under damp conditions. Today, we call it swamp gas. Back then, it was death whispering a casual hello. The scientific explanation didn't actually arrive until the 19th century, but medieval peasants didn't really need scientific explanations. They had compelling eyewitness accounts, plenty of ale, and a collective sense of utter dread. The church, of course, had its own opinions on the matter. Some priests claimed that the mysterious lights were actually angels guiding souls to heaven. Others insisted that they were sinister demons luring unsuspecting travelers to their ultimate doom because medieval theology rarely passed up a good opportunity to make things significantly worse. Either way, the ominous phenomenon effectively terrified people into confession, which the clergy considered a win-win situation. The unsettling stories persisted for centuries. Even as late as the 1600s, various scholars were writing about ignis fatuus, or foolish fire, that was still commonly visible in rural areas. Farmers blamed mischievous fairies, monks blamed unrepentant sin, and everyone blamed whales. Modern researchers eventually proved that the peasants were actually half right. The lights did exist, just not because heaven had a lantern budget. The real culprit was rotting vegetation doing its very best impression of a divine warning. So yes, the medieval corpse lights were undeniably real, just slightly less supernatural than advertised. It turns out that the Grim Reaper didn't actually need to carry a lantern after all. The bogs were more than happy to do the job for him. And if you ever happen to see one yourself, congratulations. You've just experienced a 1,000-year-old chemistry lesson with some added atmosphere. If you've ever seen one of those medieval murals filled with skeletons holding hands and waltzing around with priests and kings, congratulations. You've just encountered the Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death. It was basically the Middle Ages version of a motivational poster, except instead of live, laugh, love, it unequivocally declared, "You are next." The underlying legend claimed that at the stroke of midnight, the dead would rise from their graves to dance in the churchyard. Skeletons, nobles, peasants, all locking arms in a grotesque conga line of complete equality. The overarching message was abundantly clear. No matter your title, status, or dental plan, death doesn't actually discriminate. It was admittedly grim, yes, but it was also probably the most brutally honest thing that medieval Europe ever actually produced. The unsettling story began circulating widely after the Black Death wiped out approximately 1/3 of the entire continent. People desperately needed a way to explain why their neighbors, their priests, and their favorite innkeepers kept dying so suddenly and so frequently. So, they did what humans have always done since the dawn of time. They turned unspeakable trauma into meaningful art. Talented artists all across France and Germany painted skeletal processions on chapel walls, some even meticulously labeling the corpses as kings, knights, or popes in order to really drive the overall point home. A few added musicians to the ensemble, because apparently nothing quite says existential dread like a skeleton enthusiastically playing the drums. To medieval peasants, these somewhat morbid murals weren't necessarily depressing. They were oddly comforting. Death was simply everywhere, so it might as well have some intricately choreographed steps. It quickly became a communal myth. Villagers swore that they often heard faint music emanating from cemeteries late at night, or that they saw bones shifting ominously in the moonlight. In Paris, some people even claimed to have witnessed full-blown skeleton festivals taking place. The church, predictably, called it blasphemy. The peasants, on the other hand, found it deeply relatable. Modern historians believe that the frequent dancing dead sightings were likely just a combination of optical illusions, moonlight, fog, and rotting corpses simply doing what rotting corpses do. But honestly, if you'd actually lived through 3 plagues and 14 inquisitions, you might have seen things, too. Over time, the danse macabre spread rapidly across Europe, from striking frescoes and elaborate tapestries to intricate church carvings and even live stage plays. It was arguably the medieval world's most successful franchise, reminding everyone on a daily basis that life was short, hygiene was optional, and a good sense of humor was absolutely essential. So yes, the harrowing stories of dancing skeletons were technically true, not because the bones actually moved, but because the people undeniably did. Every dance, feast, and prayer in medieval Europe was a defiant two-step against the inevitable. The skeletons didn't actually need to rise from their graves. They were already residing inside everyone, patiently waiting for their moment in the spotlight. In the medieval imagination, hell wasn't some distant, abstract metaphysical realm. It was essentially just a really bad neighborhood with an abundance of lava. Travelers' accounts frequently spoke of real places where the earth hissed ominously, the air burned your lungs, and the locals swore that you could actually hear the tormented souls of the damned. One such spot gained particular notoriety, a foreboding lake in Iceland said to boil constantly with the agonized cries of sinners. The enduring legend began with early Christian missionaries who landed on the remote volcanic island, took one quick look around at the seemingly endless steaming craters, and reasonably concluded that they had accidentally overshot heaven by a wide margin. The earth gurgled menacingly, the ground smoked constantly, and pools bubbled ominously like ancient cauldrons. Clearly, this was undeniable proof that hell was actively leaking through into the mortal realm. Because when you've spent the vast majority of your life confined to cold, drafty monasteries, intense geothermal activity just feels deeply personal. Word spread remarkably fast. Chroniclers described waters that burned human skin and stones that hissed like venomous serpents. Pilgrims actively avoided the eerie area. Sailors gave it a wide berth. And theologians debated endlessly whether it was a literal entrance to eternal damnation or just God's somewhat angry tea kettle. The name Vereveller, meaning hot springs plain, entered into popular folklore as a literal gateway to the underworld. Later visitors even claimed to hear screams echoing hauntingly through the pervasive steam. Locals, ever practical, simply said it was just gas escaping from the deep fissures beneath the earth. Either way, Iceland quickly got branded as the premier real estate development located directly above perdition. Medieval mapmakers even labeled certain particularly desolate parts of it as Inferno Nordico, or Northern Hell. You definitely have to admire. Here's the rewritten version of the text, translated and adapted for a native U.S. English speaker, following your guidelines for translation and localization with a slight expansion. The dedication to marketing truly paid off. Centuries later, when science finally caught up, geologists explained the phenomenon. Magma heated the groundwater, turning lakes into bubbling cauldrons of boiling death. Perfectly natural. But that didn't make it any less terrifying to folks standing nearby with a fragile belief system and zero sunscreen. What's truly impressive is how long the legend stuck around. Even as late as the 17th century, European travelers kept coming home with wild stories of boiling pits that roared like demons. And honestly, if you'd spent 2 weeks at sea eating nothing but salted herring, you'd probably start hallucinating about Judgment Day, too. So, yeah, the boiling lake of hell was real, although the screams of the damned were really just steam vents putting on their best impression of human regret. Still, you gotta give it to those medieval minds. When faced with a volcano, they didn't freak out. They theologized. And somehow, that feels deeply human. For centuries, the people of Venice whispered that their city, a floating paradise of masks, canals, and highly questionable sanitation, was also crawling with vampires. Not the elegant, poetry-reading type, mind you. These were plague-bitten corpses who allegedly clawed their way out of their shallow graves to feed on the living. The legend took root during the Black Death when burial pits overflowed and people started noticing some pretty horrifying things. Some bodies looked disturbed. Shrouds were torn, faces were bloated, and dark fluids leaked from their mouths. Lacking science or even a smidge of common sense, the gravediggers figured the corpses were, well, eating. Naturally, the only logical solution was to shove a brick in their mouths. Problem solved. For ages, this sounded like some crazy medieval rumor, the kind of thing you'd expect from a civilization that also believed frogs caused thunderstorms. But in 2006, archaeologists excavating a plague pit on the Venetian island of Lazaretto Novo unearthed a real skeleton with a brick jammed square between its teeth. The tabloids went wild. The legend of the vampire of Venice had just gone from folklore to front-page news. Forensic analysis revealed the vampire was a woman, about 60 years old, which, back in the 14th century, was practically the lifespan of a minor deity. Experts explained that the brick was an early attempt to stop corpses from spreading disease. People thought the plague was caused by revenant breath, the idea that dead bodies exhaled contagion. Blocking the mouth stopped the undead, or so they hoped. Medieval public health at its finest, no soap, just masonry. It was a perfect storm of ignorance and imagination. The corpse's decomposing face had produced gases that made the shroud tear and the face bloat. Gravediggers interpreted the gory mess as evidence of feeding. And since you can't exactly arrest a dead person, they went straight for the DIY vampire dentistry solution. The discovery didn't shock anyone familiar with medieval logic. Venice had survived floods, fires, and fashion trends made of lead. A vampire seemed entirely plausible. So, yeah, the vampire of Venice was real, at least in bone and brick. Not a creature of the night, just a casualty of misunderstanding. And honestly, it's hard to blame them. If your entire city smelled like a damp tomb, and everyone you knew was dying, you'd probably start shoving rocks in corpses' mouths, too. In the year 1284, the citizens of Bologna looked up at the sky and saw something deeply unholy. No, it wasn't divine revelation. It was meat. Actual chunks of raw flesh falling from the heavens like some nightmarish medieval meat shower. Eyewitnesses swore it rained meat for several minutes, because apparently Italy just refuses to do anything halfway. The event was recorded by monks, who described a shower of bloody meat that covered the countryside. People collected the chunks and, being medieval Europeans, immediately started arguing about whether they should eat them. Scholars debated if it was angelic manna or a warning from God. Some claimed it was flesh from fallen sinners. Others optimistically suggested it might be pork. Modern science, sadly, has ruined all the fun, again. Historians and zoologists now suspect the phenomenon was caused by flocks of birds, most likely vultures, vomiting mid-flight. It's disgusting, but also perfectly in character for nature. When startled or overfed, scavenger birds tend to eject their stomach contents to lighten their load. So, in essence, Bologna experienced the first recorded case of aerial food delivery. But to medieval minds, there was no logical explanation, just divine symbolism and mild hysteria. Priests warned it was an omen of sin. Alchemists tried to preserve samples, hoping to find gold inside. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Farmers prayed for forgiveness. Butchers prayed for more of it. The bishop reportedly declared a day of fasting, which feels pretty counterproductive when meat is literally falling from the sky. Even centuries later, the legend persisted. Renaissance chroniclers described it in solemn Latin, perhaps to disguise how absurd it was. And in true medieval fashion, nobody ever cleaned it up properly. You can picture the scene: a quiet village, confused peasants, a rain of meat cubes, and one monk frantically trying to take notes while dodging brisket. It's easy to laugh now, but the flesh rain wasn't unique. Similar incidents were reported elsewhere: frogs in France, fish in Scotland, worms in Norway. The Middle Ages were basically one long episode of weather gone wrong. So, yeah, it really did rain meat in Bologna. Not the wrath of God, just the stomach of a stressed-out bird squadron. If nothing else, it proves that in medieval Europe, every miracle had an odor, and some were definitely past their expiration date. In the medieval world, people didn't trust competence. If something worked too well, it had to be witchcraft. Enter the legend of the Devil's Bridge, or rather, dozens of them. From France to Wales to Switzerland, nearly every village with a well-built bridge insisted it had been designed by Satan himself. Apparently, masonry was just above the pay grade of mere mortals. The story always went something like this: villagers needed a bridge over a gorge, a river, or some suspiciously bottomless ravine. After several failed attempts, and probably a few lost masons, they called upon the devil. He agreed to build it overnight in exchange for the soul of the first creature to cross it. Reasonable rates for medieval Europe. The villagers, being experts in loopholes and livestock, usually sent a goat or a dog across first. This enraged the devil, who'd spent the night showing off his portfolio of Gothic architecture, only to end up with a goat as payment. Furious, he either smashed the bridge unsuccessfully or vanished in a puff of sulfur, leaving the villagers with a free piece of infrastructure and a slightly traumatized animal. The most famous example stands in Lugano, Switzerland, a perfect stone arch so impossibly precise that locals still call it Ponte del Diavolo. In Wales, there's another one, the Devil's Bridge of Ceredigion, built over a roaring waterfall. According to legend, the devil himself came to collect his due, only to be tricked by an old woman's dog. To be fair, nobody outsmarts Satan quite like a Welsh grandma. Modern archaeologists, buzzkills that they are, point out that medieval stonemasons were just really good at their jobs. The bridges used ingenious keystones, symmetry, and pressure distribution, proof of advanced engineering, not infernal subcontracting. But in a world where people thought lightning was God's punctuation, demons built it was a perfectly acceptable hypothesis. Today, there are over 50 Devil's Bridges across Europe, each one a monument to humanity's long-loving relationship with paranoia and clever storytelling. So, yeah, the bridges were real. The devil probably wasn't, unless he also worked part-time as a civil engineer. Either way, the moral is clear: if you ever build something too good, expect credit from Satan, and maybe keep a goat handy, just in case. If you were a monk in medieval Yorkshire, nights at Byland Abbey weren't as peaceful as Gregorian chants might suggest. After dark, witnesses claimed the abbey came alive with groans, whispers, and the distinct sound of chains scraping across stone, not metaphorical chains, mind you, literal ones. Thus began the tale of the ghost monk of Byland, one of the oldest recorded hauntings in England, and also the most bureaucratic. In the 1400s, a scribe at Byland decided to document the abbey's many ghostly encounters. He didn't just jot them down, he cataloged them like divine case files, 20 separate hauntings, each complete with names, dates, and theological footnotes. The monks at Byland, it turned out, were living in a thoroughly haunted house. The most famous of these was the chained monk, a spirit said to rise nightly from a forgotten crypt beneath the cloisters, muttering prayers and dragging his own iron bonds behind him. Medieval monks weren't exactly subtle storytellers. According to the account, one brave brother finally confronted the ghost. When asked why he couldn't rest, the apparition explained, in flawless Latin, of course, that he had died with unconfessed sins. The chain was his penance. He begged for prayers, absolution, and ideally less attention from screaming novices. After the community held a special mass for his soul, the monk vanished, leaving behind only his rattling chain, and presumably, several traumatized witnesses. Historians love this story because it's one of the first ghost tales written as fact rather than folklore. The monk didn't appear as a cautionary symbol, he was treated like a parishioner with unfinished paperwork. It perfectly captures the medieval worldview. Ghosts weren't horror movie monsters, they were sinners waiting for customer service. Excavations centuries later found a real crypt beneath Byland Abbey with human remains bound in corroded iron links. Whether it was a relic of penance, imprisonment, or simple superstition, nobody knows, but it gave the legend just enough evidence to crawl out of the realm of myth. Before the first frost even touched the fields, medieval peasants began to panic, quietly. They didn't fear the cold itself, they feared the emptiness it brought to their tables. The harvest marked not just celebration, but calculation. How many sacks of grain could last until spring? How many turnips could be hidden in the cellar? And which pig had to die so that the others, and the family, might live? Winter wasn't poetic or romantic, it was a drawn-out test of cunning and discipline, where food preservation was the difference between survival and starvation. A medieval peasant couldn't simply store food, every crumb demanded strategy. Bread grew mold, milk spoiled, and fresh meat turned to rot within days. Without ice or refrigeration, peasants turned to the wisdom of the past, preservation methods passed down like family heirlooms. Salting, drying, smoking, and fermenting became sacred rituals. Salt was so valuable, it was called white gold, and its grains determined who survived the season and who didn't. Peasants rubbed it into meat and fish until they were dry and leathery, then hung them above smoky fires, where the combination of salt and smoke created flavors that lasted months, even years. The daily routine of preserving food became an act of faith. Barrels of cabbage bubbled into sour, tangy sauerkraut, a miracle of fermentation that peasants barely understood, yet relied upon completely. Turnips, onions, and beans were pickled in sour brine or stored in earthenware jars buried underground to escape the frost. Nothing was wasted. Animal fat became candle fuel. Bones flavored soups until they dissolved. Even spoiled ale found purpose, used to soften bread so hard it could chip a tooth. When snow blanketed the fields, the real test began. Families gathered around the hearth, gnawing on salted pork or sipping thin broth made from dried peas. They rationed carefully, always aware that spring was months away, and famine only one careless meal distant. Yet there was pride in their ingenuity, in turning decay into sustenance, in transforming scarcity into survival. For peasants, every preserved morsel was a victory over time itself, and in a world ruled by hunger, victory, however small, was enough to keep hope alive. If there was one ingredient that could decide whether a medieval family made it through the winter, it wasn't bread or meat. It was salt. That humble white crystal was more precious than gold in its time, traded, hoarded, and even fought over. Salt was the foundation of medieval food preservation, and peasants treated it with near-religious reverence. Without it, pork turned sour, fish went bad, and entire cellars of effort could vanish in a single warm week. Salting wasn't just sprinkling, it was a ritual. After slaughtering season in late autumn, families gathered to carve every inch of meat into manageable slabs. Each piece was buried in coarse salt, packed tightly in barrels or clay pots. The salt drew out every drop of moisture, robbing bacteria of the damp paradise it needed to thrive. Days later, the meat would be rinsed, dried, and sometimes hung over the hearth, where the rising smoke added another layer of defense, and a smoky perfume that defined the flavor of medieval life. Fish was treated even more carefully. Inland villages relied on dried or salted herring that arrived from the coasts, preserved so thoroughly that it was more plank than flesh. To eat it, peasants had to soak it for hours just to make it chewable. Yet they cherished every bite. It wasn't just nutrition, it was proof that human ingenuity could defy nature's cruelty. Salt also extended to vegetables and dairy. Cabbage leaves and turnips were salted before fermentation, while butter was mixed with salt and packed into wooden tubs to survive through the lean months. The result wasn't gourmet cuisine, but it was reliable, and reliability was worth more than luxury. The irony was that peasants worked the fields that produced salt, yet rarely owned it. Heavy taxes made it a luxury, even for those who mined or carried it. Some stretched it with ash or sand to make it last longer. Still, they guarded their salt barrels like treasure chests because in a world where famine lurked at every door, salt wasn't just a preservative, it was life itself, grain by grain. And each handful bought another day of hope. When salt ran short, and it often did, peasants turned to the hearth. Smoke, that gray ghost rising from every chimney, became their next ally in the endless war against decay. Smoking wasn't just cooking, it was slow alchemy. Meat hung from rafters for days, even weeks, slowly turning from raw pink to deep mahogany as curls of wood smoke whispered through the cottage. What emerged wasn't just edible, it was immortal, or at least as close to immortal as medieval peasants could hope for. Every household fire told a story of survival. In a world without chimneys as we know them, smoke filled the rafters, staining the walls black and the ceilings dark as tar. But that smoke did more than choke lungs, it coated meat in a natural armor. The compounds from burning would kill bacteria and sealed in flavor. Pork, mutton, and even fish took on a toughness and aroma that made mouths water and bellies quiet for a while. Different woods gave different characters to the food. Oak and beech were the peasants' favorites, common, steady burners that gave a mellow, nutty taste. Applewood was a rare treat, lending sweetness to pork when available. Every village had its own subtle signature smoke, depending on what trees grew nearby. And though no one could explain the science of phenols or dehydration, they understood the result: smoked meat meant survival through February. The process was messy, smoky, and exhausting. Peasants had to keep the fire low and steady, never letting it flame up and burn the meat. Women and children took turns tending the smokehouse, their eyes stinging, their clothes reeking of fire for weeks. The air inside was thick enough to chew, but so was the satisfaction when the job was done. Rows of hanging meat symbolized triumph, a visible reminder that hunger could be postponed, if not defeated. Smoked foods became staples in stews and porridges throughout winter. Even scraps, bits too small to smoke whole, were saved for flavoring soups or mixed with grains. Nothing was wasted, not fat, not bones, not time. In the medieval mind, smoke wasn't just a byproduct of fire, it was a sacred gift from the hearth, invisible, relentless, and life-saving. Before science had names for yeast or bacteria, peasants were already taming them. Fermentation was their invisible ally, a quiet, bubbling miracle that turned spoilage into sustenance. Nobody understood how it worked, but everyone knew it did work. When food began to fizz or sour, that wasn't always a disaster, sometimes it was the start of transformation. Take cabbage, for instance, a humble, unassuming vegetable that could turn into a lifesaver. Peasants shredded it, salted it, and pressed it into wooden barrels. Weeks later, what emerged was sauerkraut, sour, sharp, and surprisingly full of life. It didn't just taste better than rotting leaves, it kept better. In the middle of winter, when everything else was gray and lifeless, a spoonful of sauerkraut brought a punch of flavor and a whisper of health. Without knowing why, peasants had created a probiotic marvel centuries before scientists named it. The same magic touched milk. When fresh milk curdled, peasants didn't throw it away, they pressed it into cheese. The transformation was simple yet revolutionary. Cheese could last months, even years, depending on how it was aged. A wheel of hard cheese hanging from the rafters was as good as a gold coin. Fermented drinks also found their place: ale, mead, and cider brewed from leftover grains and fruits. These weren't luxuries, they were sterilized water substitutes, safer to drink than what came from the well. Fermentation also brought community. Every village smelled faintly of bubbling brine, rising dough, or brewing ale. Housewives shared starter cultures the way modern neighbors share recipes. Monks took the process to new heights, perfecting beer and cheese that would become famous across Europe. But for peasants, fermentation wasn't a craft, it was instinct. It was also rebellion against decay, to take food that wanted to rot and convince it to transform instead. That was sorcery in its purest form. Through salt, air, and patience, peasants preserved not just nourishment, but hope. The world outside could freeze, the fields could sleep under snow, but inside the crocks and barrels, life went on, quietly, invisibly, and beautifully alive. If salt was gold and smoke was armor, then brine was magic. Pickling was one of the most ingenious tools in a peasant's arsenal, a way to trap summer inside a jar. With little more than water, salt, vinegar, and thyme, peasants could turn limp vegetables into crisp, tangy treasures that lasted until the thaw. When fresh greens became as rare as miracles, a sour turnip could taste like salvation. Pickling began in late autumn when gardens offered their last gasp: cucumbers, onions, cabbage, carrots, garlic. Nothing escaped the brine. Families gathered around large barrels, chopping vegetables into rough chunks. Saltwater brine or vinegar mixtures were poured over them, and sometimes herbs were thrown in for flavor: dill, mustard seed, or wild garlic, if available. The smell was strong enough to drive away rats, and perhaps small children, but it was the smell of survival. The science was simple, though they didn't know it. Acid and salt created an environment where bacteria that caused rot couldn't thrive. Instead, friendly bacteria took over, transforming vegetables into sour, crunchy, vitamin-rich stores. In an age when scurvy and malnutrition were constant threats, pickled foods were lifesavers. Even the poorest families who couldn't afford much salt could still manage a few jars of brine, hidden away under floorboards or in cold corners. Pickling wasn't limited to vegetables either. Eggs, fish, and even leftover meat were sometimes sealed in vinegar or brine, though such experiments were risky and rarely delicious. Still, when desperation hit, flavor came second to preservation. The taste of brine, sharp, salty, and vinegary, became the taste of winter itself. For medieval peasants, every jar told a story. Each one represented a family's foresight, effort, and the stubborn refusal to give up comfort to hunger. And when a child opened a jar in mid-January and caught the scent of last autumn's harvest, it wasn't just food they tasted, it was memory. Pickling turned ordinary people into quiet alchemists, transforming decay into endurance. It was their way of defying nature's cruelty with nothing more than salt, patience, and an unshakable belief that spring would come again. Long before electricity or ovens, the medieval peasant learned to use the simplest element of all, air. Drying was preservation stripped to its essence. It didn't require salt, barrels, or brine, only patience and a bit of sun, wind, or fire. And for those too poor to afford much salt, drying became the last line of defense between a full stomach and starvation. Everything that could dry, did. Apples were sliced thin and strung on twine, dangling above the hearth like garlands. Peas and beans were spread across woven mats to harden in the wind, while herbs, mint, thyme, rosemary, hung in clusters from roof beams, their scent blending with wood smoke and damp earth. Even mushrooms were threaded onto cords, turning leathery and dark as they slowly gave up their moisture. Dried food was light, compact, and resistant to the rot that thrived in moisture. Meat and fish, too, could be dried when salt was scarce. Thin cuts were laid across wooden racks exposed to the breeze, sometimes brushed with vinegar or smoke for extra safety. In the colder months, drying happened indoors, near fires that stayed burning from dawn till dusk. The result wasn't exactly tender. A dried piece of beef could double as a weapon, but when rehydrated in stew, it became edible once more. For the medieval palate, edible was often good enough. Dried grains and legumes, however, were the true backbone of survival. Lentils, barley, and peas could be stored for years in sacks or clay jars. Peasants soaked them overnight, boiled them for hours, and stretched them with scraps of meat or turnips to feed whole families. These humble foods lacked glamour, but they outlasted the most extravagant feasts of the nobility. Drying was also a social ritual. Neighbors worked side by side, sharing fire pits and spreading produce in communal yards. Children turned fruit slices or watched for birds trying to steal them. Every flap of drying cloth, every hiss of steam from the hearth carried a message of defiance. We will not starve this winter. Through drying, peasants learned to harness air itself, invisible, patient, and impartial, and turn it into armor against time. In a world that rotted quickly, dried food was a quiet promise: life extended. Preservation didn't end once the food was cured, smoked, or dried. The next challenge was where to keep it safe. In a world before refrigeration, medieval peasants relied on the earth itself as their refrigerator. The ground was steady, cool, and dependable, so they built their storage not above it, but beneath it. The cellar was the silent guardian of the peasant household, a dark, damp sanctuary where food could outlast the sun. Every peasant home, no matter how humble, had some form of storage pit or root cellar. Some were little more than holes lined with straw and stones, others were carefully dug underground chambers with wooden shells and thatched roofs. These cellars stayed around 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, even in the dead of winter, a perfect climate for preserving vegetables, grains, and salted meats. It was the medieval version of climate control, courtesy of nature. Root crops like turnips, carrots, and parsnips were buried in layers of sand or straw, which kept them from rotting or freezing. Cabbages were hung upside down from beams to slow decay. Onions and garlic dangled from ropes like garlands of survival, while barrels of sauerkraut and pickled beets sat against the wall, quietly bubbling through the winter. The cellar had its place, not just for convenience, but also to keep pests and mold away. The cellar was also like a time capsule, holding a family's hard work. Every smell told a story: the sharp bite of vinegar, the smoky aroma of cured meat, the sweet earthiness of stored apples. For peasants, going into the cellar was like entering their own little museum of perseverance. They measured wealth not in coins, but by the number of jars, sacks, and barrels they had to last them until spring. In areas with poor soil or prone to flooding, peasants got inventive, storing food in cool wells, shaded attics, or even hanging baskets to keep rats out. Some even sealed grain in clay pots and buried them in the ground, where it could last for years if left undisturbed. Surviving a medieval winter wasn't just about hard work. It was about clever planning and using whatever you had. With smoke, salt, and the constant coolness of the earth, peasants transformed nature into their own personal pantry. The cellar wasn't just a storage space, it was their lifeline. Food preservation in medieval villages wasn't just something a family did, it was a community effort. When the harvest came in, everyone worked together. Families gathered in courtyards and barns, turning the year's crops into a shield against hunger. It was a time filled with activity and noise, knives chopping, fires crackling, kids running around barrels of brine and baskets of herbs. Preservation wasn't just about the food, it was about community spirit. Cooperation was key. Peasants shared tools, salt, and smokehouses because not everyone could afford them. The village oven and smoke shed were vital resources, watched over day and night in shifts. Neighbors trusted each other. Everyone had a part to play. One family might cure pork, another smoke fish, and others pickle vegetables for trade and bartering. These shared efforts built stronger bonds than any feudal law, born not from obligation but from necessity. The process also created a rhythm to rural life. Fall meant slaughtering pigs, salting meat, and turning fat into lard or tallow. Winter was for brewing, drying, and mending. Spring meant digging up the last of the buried roots and hoping the stored food hadn't gone bad. Throughout it all, preservation connected one season to the next, turning scarcity into a shared form of art. It wasn't all just grim work either. Community preservation days often turned into small celebrations. Songs filled the air as families prepared food together, laughing at mistakes, like when someone spilled a jar of precious vinegar, or when a stubborn goat ran off with a mouthful of cabbage. There was pride in knowing that a particular skill, like salting, fermenting, or drying, could help another family make it through the winter. Even faith was part of the process. Peasants sometimes blessed their stored food or marked loaves of bread with crosses before drying them. Preservation wasn't just about keeping the body alive, it was about keeping the spirit alive with hope. The shared smokehouses and pickling vats symbolized something bigger than just food. They represented unity in the face of hardship. During the long, cold months, when the fields were silent and the nights seemed endless, knowing that your neighbors had a hand in preparing your food was comforting. It was proof that even in times of poverty, no one was truly alone. Hunger divided people, but preservation brought them back together. For medieval peasants, waste was a sin against survival. Every crumb, bone, and scrap had a potential use. In a world where hunger was a yearly visitor, waste not, want not wasn't just a saying, it was a sacred rule. Wasting food was seen as tempting death itself. So peasants became experts in efficiency, turning whatever little they had into something that could feed them for another day. When a pig was slaughtered, nothing was wasted. The meat was salted, the fat was rendered into lard, and the organs, liver, heart, and stomach, were cooked the same day. Even the blood was used, mixed with oats and herbs to make blood pudding. The bones were boiled until soft, releasing every bit of fat into a thin broth. After that, they were dried and burned for ash, which was then used to make lye for soap. To a peasant, a pig wasn't just an animal, it was a survival kit. Vegetable scraps were saved for soups, peelings were fed to the chickens, and stale bread was used in pottage, a mix of everything edible simmered together. Nothing was discarded in a peasant's kitchen, everything was transformed into something else. Even spoiled ale had a purpose, poured over hard bread to soften it or used as a sour starter for vinegar. A forgotten jar of fermented cabbage wasn't a mistake, it was seasoning. Water, too, was precious. Since it was often unsafe to drink, broth and ale were used instead. Peasants reused cooking water repeatedly, thickening it with barley or beans until it was more like glue than soup. But that glue kept bellies full and spirits alive through long, hungry nights. This intense practicality wasn't just cleverness, it came from centuries of needing to survive. Generations who had experienced famine and disease learned that abundance was fleeting and waste was unforgivable. They created a culture of thrift where even ashes had value. And through that thrift, they found dignity. By the end of winter, when the last smoked hams hung brittle and the final onions sprouted in the dark, peasants didn't see deprivation, they saw victory. Every meal that stretched, every scrap reused, was proof of their triumph over decay. In a harsh, cold world, survival itself was the greatest feast of all. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't really about love, it was about strategic advantage. Getting married meant negotiating deals, combining resources, and securing alliances that could last for generations. A noble wedding wasn't a private matter, it was a public agreement. Kings used it to expand their empires, dukes used it to gain land, and peasants used it to make sure they survived. The church might have preached about holy matrimony, but behind the hymns, there was some cold calculation going on. Among the upper classes, marriages were like political chess moves. A French princess might find herself sent to England at the age of 14, promised to a boy she'd never met, all because her father needed peace with a rival kingdom. The church said you needed consent, but consent in medieval Latin often meant that your parents said yes. A woman's dowry, gold, land, or livestock, became her ticket into marriage, while the husband's title gave her family prestige. Love might come later, if it came at all. Even peasants approached marriage with a practical mindset. Romance was nice, but survival was better. A man needed help working the fields and caring for livestock. A woman needed protection and a stable life. Getting married young meant more hands to work and children to support aging parents. In most cases, affection grew out of working together rather than romantic feelings. The wedding feast was a rare treat. Ale flowed freely, bread was baked, and neighbors gossiped about who brought the biggest dowry. Then, the real work began. Still, the church tried to keep things orderly in these unions. Priests insisted on witnesses and public vows to prevent secret marriages that could mess up inheritance claims. A couple had to get married in daylight at the church door, with the priest's blessing. But beneath the surface, there was tension between religion and reality. The church said marriage was forever, but nobles treated it like it was disposable when politics demanded it. Basically, medieval marriage was less about emotions and more about obligations. Husbands saw their wives as investments. Wives saw marriage as insurance. And the church saw it as a way to control people's desires. It was a triangle of faith, money, and physical attraction. And for most people, love was the least reliable of the three. In the Middle Ages, weddings united land and family lines long before they united hearts. If medieval marriage was a business deal, the church acted as both the accountant and the enforcer. By the 12th century, the Catholic Church had claimed complete control over who could get married, when they could get married, and what reasons they could use to get out of it, which was almost never. Marriage became a sacrament, something sacred and binding in the eyes of God, not just in the eyes of people. Once the vows were said, there was no going back. Not by a king, not by the Pope, not even by crying. This power gave priests a lot of control over people's personal lives. They decided what was considered lawful love and what was considered sin. The rules were strict. No close relatives, no bigamy, no secret weddings, and officially, no sex before the priest gave his blessing. Cousins within 7 degrees of kinship weren't allowed to marry, although in reality, nobles just paid the church for special permission to make it all okay. Money, as always, made sense something you could negotiate. The church's rules constantly clashed with what people actually wanted. Husbands wanted heirs. Wives wanted security. Lovers wanted freedom. But the church demanded purity before marriage, faithfulness after marriage, and no divorce at all. The only way out was death or an annulment. And annulments were rarer than miracles. To get one, you had to prove that the marriage was invalid from the very beginning, that someone was too young, forced into it, unable to have children, or already married to someone else. For the average peasant, that was impossible. For a noble, it was just a matter of paperwork and convincing the right people. Confession booths became quiet battlefields of conscience. Priests heard endless stories of cheating, unwanted marriages, and broken promises, sins that couldn't be undone but had to be forgiven over and over again. The church preached that marriage tamed lust and kept things morally in order. But it also made hypocrisy widespread. Kings who outlawed adultery in their lands often did it themselves in their castles, and the church looked the other way in exchange for a generous donation. The result was a society bound by holy law but driven by human weaknesses. The church claimed to protect the sanctity of marriage, but its own strict rules turned it into a gilded cage. Behind every eternal vow, there was a quiet wish for escape, and that became part of the medieval mindset too. Nowhere was marriage more strategic or more dangerous than in royal courts. A king's bedroom was a battlefield disguised as a bridal suite. Every royal marriage was a treaty written in silk, a calculated move to unite kingdoms, silence enemies, or claim thrones through family lines. Love, if it happened at all, was accidental and often inconvenient. Kings and queens rarely chose their own partners. Their advisors, bishops, and ambassadors did that for them. A marriage between a French princess and an English prince could mean peace, or more likely, 20 years of war. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example. She was first married to Louis VII of France, bringing a huge inheritance of land with her. But when their marriage didn't produce a male heir, the church allowed an annulment. Within months, she married Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become Henry II of England, turning her dowry into the spark that ignited centuries of conflict between England and France. Royal weddings were public shows, parades of power meant to impress both God and the people. But behind the veils and banners, there was distrust. Queens were expected to be fertile, quiet, and loyal. Kings were expected to be strong, dominant, and discreet about their cheating. When they weren't, scandal followed like a disease. A queen who couldn't have children could face exile or annulment. A king's adultery was considered a private matter. Hypocrisy was built into royal law. Marriages often served as chess pieces long after the ceremony. Monarchs used them to legitimize conquests or absorb rivals. A widow could be forced to remarry to strengthen a dynasty, even if she hated her new husband. Powerful people sometimes even claimed spiritual kinship to block marriages that threatened their interests, using religious excuses for political sabotage. And when love actually appeared in the royal court, it was treated like a dangerous disease. Affairs could start wars. Rumors of illegitimate children could destroy dynasties. The sanctity of marriage was preached in cathedrals but betrayed in royal chambers. The truth is, royalty never married for love, they married for advantage. Every royal wedding was a gamble, and every royal affair was a potential revolution. In medieval Europe, passion was treason, marriage was strategy, and love, when it happened, was the most dangerous game of all. If marriage in the Middle Ages was about duty, adultery was about rebellion, and it was pretty common. The church thundered that cheating was a deadly sin that would send you straight to hell. But a lot of Europe's nobles seemed to have skipped that sermon. Kings, knights, and even priests found ways to twist virtue to fit their desires. And while the church tried to control people's bodies through confession and laws, desire found its own secret world. Among nobles, affairs were almost political. A king's mistress might have more influence than a bishop. Royal lovers whispered secrets that could bring down kingdoms. When King Philip IV of France accused the wives of his knights, the daughters-in-law of the Templars, of adultery, it wasn't about morality, it was about power. By shaming them, he stripped their husbands of their political standing. Scandal in royal courts was a weapon that was sharper than any sword. For ordinary people, adultery had harsher consequences. A peasant woman who was caught cheating could be beaten, have her head shaved, or be paraded through the village in disgrace. Her husband risked being ridiculed, but his reputation usually survived. The unfairness was blatant. Men's lust was tolerated, while women's was condemned. Medieval society treated a woman's virtue like money. Once it was spent, it was gone forever. But not all passion was hidden in shame. The culture of courtly love, which started in the 12th century with troubadours and poets, turned adultery into an art form. Noblemen wrote poems for married women, celebrating forbidden desire under the guise of chivalry. To love a woman you couldn't touch was considered the most refined thing to do, although in reality, many troubadours ignored that rule. The church tried to fight back with laws about repentance and moral plays. Priests warned that adulterers would burn forever on spits of fire. But even some abbots kept mistresses hidden behind monastery walls. Confession became a cycle of sin and forgiveness, guilt and relapse. Adultery in the Middle Ages wasn't just about lust, it was about language, politics, and defiance. It showed the hypocrisy of a society that demanded purity but sold indulgences. Everyone condemned it, but almost everyone participated in it. Beneath the surface of every solemn marriage vow, there was the same unholy truth: love and law had never spoken the same language. Divorce, as we think of it today, didn't exist in the medieval world. To end a marriage was to challenge God himself, and that rarely ended well. But where there were rules, there were loopholes. And the church's favorite was the annulment. It wasn't technically a divorce, it was a declaration that the marriage had never really existed in the first place. For nobles and monarchs, it became the most elegant way to bend the rules. Annulments were built on the idea of purity. The church argued that for a marriage to be valid, both partners had to freely consent, have sex, and be eligible under church law. If one of those things could be questioned, if the bride was too young, if they were distant cousins, or if the marriage had never been physically consummated, a court might grant an annulment. However, what really mattered was less about religion and more about politics and money. Kings used annulments as weapons. Henry II's son, Philip Augustus of France, famously abandoned his wife, Ingeborg of Denmark, just a day after their wedding, claiming she made him physically sick. He asked the church for an annulment based on spiritual incompatibility, which was such a vague reason that it was almost funny. When the Pope refused, Philip simply locked her away in a convent and married someone else anyway. In the medieval hierarchy of sin, royal desire usually trumped holy law. For ordinary people, annulments were just a fantasy. The process was expensive, bureaucratic, and required witnesses who were willing to testify about the most intimate details of a couple's life. Some cases dragged on for years, becoming public displays of humiliation. Women, in particular, suffered. If an annulment declared that the marriage was void, their children could be declared illegitimate, losing their inheritance and status in one single decision. Still, annulments acted as a release valve for a society that was stifled by its own morality. They allowed powerful people to rewrite their vows when it was convenient and allowed the church to maintain its authority while pretending to uphold divine law. Everyone won, except for the person being thrown aside. Behind every annulment, there was a story of manipulation disguised in religious language. It was where confession met politics, where religious beliefs were bent to fit influence, and where the sanctity of marriage became just another asset to be negotiated, sold, or erased. In the Middle Ages, scandal was a form of entertainment, and adultery, betrayal, or annulment could turn anyone from a queen to a peasant into a public spectacle. Reputation was like money, and when it was ruined, it spread faster than the plague. The church preached morality from the pulpit, but gossip was the real religion of medieval Europe. And nowhere was it practiced more devoutly than in marriage scandals. When noble unions fell apart, it wasn't just a family issue, it was a public performance. Courtiers whispered, troubadours wrote songs, and historians recorded the drama. Take King Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Their marriage began as a pious alliance but ended in a clash of personalities. She was bold, educated, and independent. He was devout, hesitant, and boring. Their annulment in 1152 shocked Europe, not because it was rare, but because Eleanor immediately married Henry Plantagenet, the future King of England. The Queen of France had switched thrones in a single season, setting the stage for centuries of bloodshed between their descendants. People were fascinated by these stories. The same church that forbade gossip also fueled it by reading confessions aloud as moral lessons. Accusations of adultery could ruin noble women, even when they weren't proven. The daughters-in-law of Philip IV, locked in the Tower of Nesle scandal, were publicly accused of cheating. 2 were imprisoned, 1 was executed, while the men involved got away with mild punishments. For queens, virtue wasn't just a moral ideal, it was political armor. One rumor could destroy an entire dynasty. Even among commoners, marital scandal meant social death. A wife who was accused of being unfaithful might be forced to do public penance, barefoot, carrying candles, with her hair shaved off. Meanwhile, husbands could brag about their affairs in taverns without any consequences. The double standard was as medieval as the cathedrals where the sermons were preached. Scandal had a paradoxical power. It could shame, but it could also immortalize. Those who defied the church's strict expectations, like Eleanor, like countless unnamed lovers, became legends of defiance, cloaked in sin. Medieval marriage might have been bound by law and faith, but gossip made sure that no one ever forgot its failures. In a world obsessed with salvation, a good scandal was the closest thing to immortality. Every era has its rebels, and in the Middle Ages, rebellion often came disguised as love. Behind the iron bars of duty and piety, forbidden romance flickered like candlelight, fragile but defiant. These weren't fairy tales about knights and maidens, they were acts of quiet rebellion against the iron grip of the church and the crown. One of the most infamous examples was the affair between King Henry II of England and Rosamund Clifford, a noble woman who was known for her beauty. Their relationship became the scandal of Europe. Henry's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was brilliant, powerful, and unwilling to be humiliated, allegedly had Rosamund confined to a convent, where she died under suspicious circumstances. The story spread like wildfire, retold by poets who turned sin into a legend. To the church, it was adultery. To the people, it was a tragedy painted in silk and blood. Forbidden love wasn't just for royalty. Clergymen who had taken vows of celibacy were notorious for breaking them. Many kept secret wives, known as concubinae, living quietly near monasteries. Bishops condemned this behavior. Yet, it was so widespread that church councils repeatedly issued decrees against it, but with little success. Love, it seemed, was a harder vice to conquer than greed. For commoners, forbidden love was often an act of desperation. A serf couldn't legally marry outside his lord's domain without permission, and runaway lovers risked flogging or imprisonment. Yet, there were stories of couples fleeing into the woods, exchanging vows before God alone. They called it handfasting. To them, love was sacred, with or without the church's blessing. These forbidden unions were dangerous, but they were also human. They revealed a truth that medieval law tried to hide: passion couldn't be legislated. Whether it was in royal chambers or peasant cottages, love ignored the chains of hierarchy and faith. And although many of these stories ended in ruin, a poisoned cup, a public penance, and excommunication, they left behind something more enduring than scandal. They created cracks in the facade of divine order, reminding the medieval world that even under crowns, habits, and armor, the human heart refused to obey. When medieval marriages fell apart, the emotional cost was huge. But the social and financial price was even higher. In a world where marriage was sacred, breaking it was like blasphemy. And yet, people still tried, driven by desperation. The outcome was rarely fair, often cruel, and always public. For noble families, separation was a war fought in velvet gloves. A husband might send his wife to a convent for the sake of her soul, which conveniently freed him to pursue another alliance. A wife seeking freedom had far fewer options. She could run away, appeal to the church, or find protection with powerful relatives. The church sometimes allowed separatio mensa et toro, which meant separation from bed and board. This meant that the couple could live apart, but they were still married in the eyes of God. No remarriage, no fresh start, just a colder, quieter prison. Money made everything more complicated. Dowries had to be repaid, lands divided, servants reassigned. Women who left their husbands risked losing everything, even their children. Medieval law viewed children as the husband's property, especially among the nobility, where heirs were political assets. Some desperate mothers disguised themselves to see their children secretly, relying on the kindness of servants. The emotional cruelty of sacred marriage was often its sharpest punishment. Among the poor, separations were simpler, but no less painful. A man might just leave and never come back. Villages whispered, priests scolded, but life went on. A deserted wife might take another partner unofficially, a common law arrangement that was tolerated as long as it didn't cause a scandal. The church could rage from the pulpit, but it couldn't control every household. For women of rank, escape required influence or scandal. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, endured years of humiliation before securing an annulment from King Louis VII. Few others could even dream of such freedom. Most women who defied their husbands were crushed by legal and spiritual shame. In the end, separation in the Middle Ages was never about healing, it was about survival. It exposed the double standards that ruled both the bedroom and the altar. Men could stray, annul, or abandon. Women could only endure. The church called this divine order. But for countless broken souls, it was simply injustice wearing a halo. By the end of the Middle Ages, marriage, adultery, and divorce had woven themselves into a complicated moral tapestry, half sacred, half scandalous. What had started as a divine union had become a system of control, binding hearts with politics and law. Yet, through all the hypocrisy, a quiet evolution was taking place. The medieval world, which was so obsessed with purity and order, had unknowingly laid the groundwork for the modern idea of love. The church, for all its strictness, had at least given marriage permanence, which provided stability in the chaos of feudal life. It insisted that even kings had to honor their vows, that consent mattered, and that marriage was more than just an exchange of property. Ironically, those same rules also trapped countless people in loveless marriages. But within those constraints, individuals began to demand something new, affection. The idea that marriage should involve love was radical, even dangerous. Yet, it was spreading like wildfire through songs, poems, and whispered dreams. Courtly love had started as noble flirtation, but in the 15th century, wooing, not just wedding, had become a moral expectation. Men were now expected to court their future wives, and women began to view themselves as more than just property, they were partners, at least in theory. The poetry of the troubadours, which had once been considered frivolous, started to shape real human desire. It wasn't enough anymore to simply have a wife, a man had to love her. The seed of romance had been planted in soil that was once solely governed by contract. However, the darker legacies of the past persisted. Laws regarding annulment, the double standards surrounding adultery, and the lack of true divorce continued to define European society for centuries. A woman's reputation remained as fragile as glass, while a man's sins were easily forgiven. Even kings who redefined the rules, like Henry VIII centuries later, did so out of ambition, not out of a sense of justice. Still, the contradictions of medieval marriage left behind more than just broken vows, they left behind questions. What is love without freedom? What is faith without mercy? The medieval heart lived under the weight of heavy chains, but it never stopped yearning. And that yearning for choice, for equality, for love both unbidden and pure, became the first whisper of modern romance. Out of the political landscape of passion, the human soul slowly rediscovered itself. In 17th century Kyoto, amidst the fading glory of samurai rule, a new world quietly emerged, one dedicated not to war or politics, but to pleasure. The shogunate, weary of rebellion and eager to control vice, decided that even desire itself needed to be ordered. This led to the birth of the yukaku, licensed pleasure quarters where passion could be taxed, beauty could be regulated, and illusion could be perfected. The most famous of these was Shimabara, Kyoto's own walled paradise. Within its gates, the ordinary rules of society relaxed. Merchants mingled with samurai, poets with courtesans, and monks with men who forgot their vows. Lanterns glowed like fireflies along the narrow alleys leading to tea houses, where laughter floated through the paper screens. It was a self-contained universe, a city of dreams sealed off from the rigid world beyond its wooden gates. However, the yukaku were not merely brothels. They were theaters of refinement where pleasure was meticulously staged with precision and artistry. Courtesans, or oiran, were trained from childhood, not just in seduction, but also in poetry, calligraphy, and the tea ceremony. They memorized the art of conversation as diligently as a samurai studied swordsmanship. A night with an oiran was less of a transaction and more of a performance, an elegant display of wit, fragrance, and illusion. Kyoto's floating world, or Ukiyo, took its name from a Buddhist term meaning transient world. Yet, in this context, transience became liberation, an opportunity to forget death, duty, and the heavy constraints of honor. Here, one could drift between reality and fantasy, savoring beauty that was never meant to last. The sound of shamisen strings echoed from tea-house balconies, mingling with the scent of incense and plum blossoms. Still, beneath the painted smiles and silken sleeves, the yukaku were built on contradictions. They promised freedom within walls, refinement born from control, and love that could be bought but never truly possessed. Every illusion cast a shadow. The women who entertained emperors and merchants alike lived as both artists and prisoners, their elegance masking a lifetime of discipline and debt. And yet, Kyoto's pleasure quarters endured for centuries, preserved like a dream that refused to fade. They became the heart of Japan's cultural identity, where beauty was ritualized, and every glance, gesture, and breath was art. Before geisha refined the art of entertainment, the heart of Kyoto's pleasure quarters belonged to the oiran, the high courtesans of the Edo period. They were not simply women of desire, but arbiters of fashion, poetry, and elegance. To enter their presence was like stepping into a painting, every movement meticulously rehearsed, every word chosen as carefully as a brushstroke on silk. Yet, behind their lacquered poise lay lives dictated by discipline, debt, and illusion. The journey to becoming an oiran began in childhood. Young girls, often sold by impoverished families, were taken into okiya, boarding houses run by strict proprietors. There, they trained for years under relentless supervision. Their lessons included dancing, shamisen performance, calligraphy, flower arrangement, and the tea ceremony, everything that could transform a child into a living work of art. Mistakes were punished, while progress was rewarded with praise that was always conditional. By the time they came of age, these women could recite poems, play music, and charm nobles who considered them equals in wit, if not in social status. But this prestige came at a cost. The oiran lived under a rigid hierarchy, with only a handful, the taiyu, attaining celebrity status. These elite courtesans could command the wealthiest clients, and their company was negotiated like political treaties. A visit to a taiyu was a privilege reserved for men of immense status, who were expected to match her refinement, intelligence, and wealth. Courting her could take months, requiring gifts, letters, and formal introductions. The taiyu didn't chase desire, she dictated it. Her appearance was legendary, with towering platform sandals, kimonos layered like armor, and a coiffure so elaborate that it required assistance to maintain. To walk through Shimabara streets, she moved slowly and deliberately, a procession of grace surrounded by attendants. Passers-by bowed in silence, not out of lust, but out of reverence. Yet, behind this performance lay a quieter truth. For all their status, oiran were commodities bound by contract. They could entertain poets and samurai, but they couldn't love freely. Each smile was rehearsed, each secret carefully bartered. And still, within their gilded cages, they created art so exquisite that it transcended its origins. The oiran became both muse and myth, women who turned captivity into culture, their names whispered long after their world faded into memory. As Kyoto's pleasure quarters evolved, a new figure emerged from the shadows. Less bound by luxury and more defined by art, the geisha, literally person of the arts, began not as courtesans, but as entertainers. They played music, poured tea, told stories, and kept conversation flowing when words faltered. Yet, over time, their grace, intellect, and subtle allure began to eclipse the courtesans they once served. The first geisha were men, witty performers hired to amuse guests while they waited for the oiran. However, women soon mastered the art, and by the 18th century, female geisha had transformed Kyoto's nightlife. Unlike the heavily adorned taiyu, the geisha embodied restraint. Their beauty was minimalist, with pale skin, simple kimonos, and understated hairstyles. They didn't dazzle with jewels, they captivated with timing, expression, and mystery. Where the oiran offered fantasy, the geisha offered conversation. Training began young under the guidance of an okasan, or mother, of the tea house. Apprentices, known as maiko, learned to dance, sing, play the shamisen, and master the unspoken rules of social subtlety, when to laugh softly, when to lower their eyes, and when to turn silence into charm. The transformation from maiko to geisha was marked by a ceremony, with the hairstyle simplified, the makeup softened, and innocence replaced by composure. The geisha's role was not transactional in the same way as the oiran. They could entertain the same guests night after night without promise of physical exchange. Their worth came from refinement, the ability to make others feel seen, relaxed, and important. A true geisha could command attention without ever raising her voice. Her gestures were poetry, her presence a performance. Still, the line between art and desire was delicate. Many men fell in love with geisha, imagining romance where only illusion existed. Patronage often blurred into intimacy, though the geisha remained emotionally untouchable. Her livelihood depended on maintaining that fragile balance between affection and distance. By the late Edo period, geisha had replaced oiran as the queens of the ukiyo, the floating world. They represented Japan's transition from the gilded excess of feudal pleasure to the quiet elegance of artistic mastery. Where once beauty was bought, now it was performed. And perfection, as always in Kyoto, was the most seductive illusion of all. In Kyoto's pleasure quarters, nothing was ever entirely real, not the smiles, not the affection, and not even the names. Everything was artifice, and that was precisely the point. The ukiyo, the floating world, promised escape, not truth. Guests entered its tea houses not to find love, but to forget the weight of obligation. And the women who entertained them, whether geisha or maiko, became masters of illusion, sculptors of mood and memory. Every detail was deliberate. The lighting was soft enough to flatter faces and blur age. Incense drifted through the air, erasing the smells of sake and sweat. Conversations followed rhythms designed to soothe pride and provoke fascination. Even silence had a choreography. When a geisha poured tea, she did it with the same grace a priest used to bless an altar, every gesture carrying unspoken meaning, a raised sleeve, a subtle smile, a pause between words. The art lay not in seduction, but in control. To outsiders, the geisha's poise seemed effortless, but it was built on years of discipline. Behind every evening's laughter were hours of practice, perfecting shamisen chords, memorizing dance steps, and learning the psychology of men who needed to feel powerful even while being gently handled. A single misstep, a laugh too loud, an expression too familiar, could ruin her mystique. The illusion depended on balance, closeness without attachment, grace without surrender. Yet, not all illusions served pleasure. For many geisha, it was also a mask for survival. Beneath the painted calm lay exhaustion, debt, and loneliness. Their profession demanded emotional fluency, the ability to listen to confessions without judgment, to feign affection without expectation. They became confidants, muses, and therapists for samurai and merchants who carried the burdens of power. And though men left the tea house feeling lighter, the women remained, resetting the scene for the next performance. Still, within that endless cycle of illusion, something profound emerged. The geisha transformed fleeting moments into timeless art. She turned transience, that Buddhist idea of impermanence, into beauty itself. The floating world was never meant to last, but that was its secret strength. In a city obsessed with control and tradition, Kyoto's geisha mastered the one art the samurai never could, how to make ephemerality feel eternal. Inside Kyoto's pleasure quarters, art was the true currency. The geisha's world revolved around mastery of conversation, performance, and, most importantly, atmosphere. Her domain was not the brothel, but the okaya, the tea house, where pleasure took the form of subtlety. Here, entertainment was not loud or vulgar, it unfolded like a poem, slow, deliberate, and layered with meaning. The tea ceremony lay at the center of this ritualized world. To outsiders, it looked simple, a woman pouring hot water over powdered green tea. But every movement followed centuries of tradition. The way the geisha turned the cup, the measured silence between gestures, even the angle of her gaze, were all choreographed acts of grace. The guest's role was to receive, not to possess. To drink from her hands was to enter a moment of harmony, fleeting and sacred. When night deepened and sake replaced tea, the atmosphere transformed. The sound of the shamisen, a three-stringed lute, echoed through the dim light, playful or melancholic depending on the mood. A maiko might rise to dance, her sleeves flowing like water, her steps recounting tales of love, loss, or rebirth. Each movement was symbolic. A tilt of the head could suggest longing, a turn of the wrist, surrender. The audience, often intoxicated yet entranced, watched as the boundary between art and emotion dissolved. Music, poetry, and conversation blended seamlessly. A skilled geisha could flatter without flattery, tease without insult, and draw laughter from a samurai who hadn't smiled in years. Her power lay not in the body, but in the mind, the ability to read a room and control it with charm. To be dull or impatient was social suicide. The geisha's grace made her indispensable at gatherings where deals were struck and alliances cemented. To outsiders, this might have looked like play, but to the women of the pleasure quarters, it was labor, art performed under pressure. The refinement was real, but so was the exhaustion. Yet the geisha's endurance turned art into armor. In every note, every pour of tea, she declared silent mastery over a world that sought to define her. Through elegance, she reigned, not with force, but with presence. Beneath Kyoto's serene lantern light, the pleasure quarters were not just sanctuaries of art, they were arenas of power. Every guest who entered an okaya brought more than curiosity, he brought politics, wealth, and ambition. Patronage was the bloodstream of the geisha world, and every smile, every shared cup of sake, carried the weight of negotiation. A geisha's livelihood depended on her patrons, known as dana. These men, merchants, officials, or retired samurai, provided financial support in exchange for companionship and prestige. A dana might pay for her kimono, her training, even her lodging. But this wasn't ownership, it was status. To have a geisha as one's companion signified sophistication, proof of taste and influence. And for the geisha, a generous patron meant security in a profession built on uncertainty. But relationships within this world were governed by unspoken rules. The dana could not demand affection, only access. Intimacy, if it existed, was bound by etiquette, concealed beneath layers of politeness and ceremony. To display jealousy or dominance in public would ruin both reputations. The geisha's power lay in her restraint. Her refusal to be claimed elevated her above simple indulgence. Behind these refined exchanges, however, pulsed a ruthless economy. The okiya that managed geisha operated like businesses, tracking every debt, the cost of kimonos, instruments, and lessons. A woman might owe her house thousands of yen before she could call herself independent. The favor of a patron wasn't just a luxury, it was survival. Losing one could mean slipping into obscurity. Politics, too, seeped into this floating world. The shogunate tolerated the pleasure quarters because they offered controlled release, a place where samurai could forget politics without causing rebellion. Yet, the most powerful men often used these spaces to forge alliances or whisper secrets. A single geisha, trusted by the right men, could wield influence greater than any courtier. But every favor had a price. Patronage could turn into possession, affection into leverage. The geisha walked a tightrope, balancing gratitude and independence, charm and manipulation. Her success was measured not by wealth alone, but by how gracefully she could survive dependence without surrendering herself to it. In Kyoto's world of artful illusion, the most dangerous game wasn't seduction, it was freedom. Beneath the shimmering silk and painted serenity, the pleasure quarters hid lives that were anything but effortless. To the outside world, geisha and maiko embodied grace, living works of art untouched by hardship. Yet, behind the scenes, their world was one of strict discipline, silent hierarchies, and relentless performance. Every smile had a schedule, every gesture an expectation. The okiya, or geisha house, functioned less like a home and more like an institution. The okasan, the house mother, ruled with precision and authority. She oversaw finances, arranged patronage, and enforced obedience. The girls under her care were investments. From the moment a maiko entered the house, her future was a ledger of debts, lessons in dance, shamisen, kimono fittings, hairdressing, each recorded, each owed. Freedom came only after years of service and countless performances. Daily life followed an exacting rhythm. Mornings began early with hours of training in music, etiquette, and movement. Meals were simple and quick. Leisure was rare. The slightest mistake, a misplayed note, a stumble in dance, could invite scolding or humiliation. Even appearance was a form of labor. The maiko's iconic hairstyle took hours to construct, heavy with wax and ornaments, and she was forbidden to sleep lying down, lest it collapse. The beauty admired by patrons was maintained through discomfort, even pain. Despite the hardships, sisterhood formed among the women. Older geisha mentored apprentices, teaching them how to navigate the unspoken rules of men and money. Bonds forged in shared exhaustion became quiet acts of rebellion, a reminder that even in captivity, solidarity could exist. Yet rivalry simmered, too. Success in the pleasure quarters meant survival, and competition for clients and prestige was constant. Emotionally, the toll was immense. A geisha was trained to mask her feelings, to smile through heartbreak, to charm those she despised, to feign contentment while yearning for escape. Love was dangerous, sometimes forbidden, attachment could cost her reputation or livelihood. Still, many took pride in their craft. They were not victims, but professionals, artists who had mastered endurance as an art form. Beneath the silken facade was resilience, quiet and unyielding. The floating world may have belonged to illusion, but its women built their dignity in reality. Through grace under pressure and survival behind a painted smile, as the 19th century unfolded, Kyoto's pleasure quarters began to fade like a lantern at dawn. The floating world, once the center of elegance and illusion, found itself caught in the tide of modernization. The samurai were vanishing, the merchant class was rising, and Japan itself was turning its gaze toward the west. The yukaku, with its silken rituals and rigid hierarchies, seemed like a relic from a dream the country was trying to forget. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 brought sweeping reforms, and with them, discomfort. The government sought to present Japan as a modern nation, free from the immorality of licensed pleasure. Brothels were restricted, courtesans lost status, and the word oiran itself began to vanish from polite conversation. The women who once held power through art and allure were forced into obscurity, their traditions rebranded or banned. The floating world began to sink. Yet, not everything perished. The geisha, ever adaptable, redefined themselves. No longer bound to the fading world of political patronage, they turned their art toward entertainment and preservation. They became cultural ambassadors, curators of Japan's aesthetic soul. Where once they played for samurai and poets, they now performed for diplomats and aristocrats. The illusion endured, but its purpose had changed. No longer an escape from duty, but a reminder of refinement amid change. Kyoto's Hanamachi, the flower districts, survived where others fell silent. Places like Gion and Pontocho transformed into living museums of elegance, where art thrived without scandal. The geisha evolved into guardians of heritage, keeping alive the dances, songs, and customs that modernization threatened to erase. Even as railways roared and factories rose, the soft strum of the shamisen continued to echo through narrow alleyways, a whisper of the old ukiyo. Still, the transition was bittersweet. Many women who once wore silk and painted faces found themselves discarded by time, their art reduced to spectacle. What had begun as rebellion and beauty became nostalgia, a performance for memory rather than pleasure. The floating world had not died, it had transformed. Beneath the electric glow of New Japan, Kyoto's pleasure quarters remained half shadow, half echo, reminders of a time when illusion itself was the highest art, and beauty, no matter how fleeting, was worth everything. Today, the ghosts of Kyoto's pleasure quarters still breathe through the narrow alleys of Gion. The wooden facades, paper lanterns, and quiet footfalls of Gaiko, Kyoto's term for geisha, preserve the last traces of the ukiyo, the floating world. Time has eroded the boundaries between art and memory, but the spirit of that lost realm endures, elegant, melancholy, and unyieldingly beautiful. Modern visitors to Kyoto often imagine the geisha as symbols of erotic mystery, unaware that they now stand as the protectors of a nearly vanished art form. The performances that once entertained samurai and poets have become living archives of Japan's aesthetic soul. Every gesture, every note on the shamisen, carries centuries of refinement. The Gaiko of Gion no longer live in a world of politics and patronage. Theirs is a quieter, more fragile existence, sustained by tourism and cultural reverence rather than power. Yet, the illusion remains. To see a Maiko, an apprentice geisha, gliding down Hanamikoji Street at twilight is to witness time itself hesitate. Her ornate kimono, her slow, deliberate steps, her downcast gaze are all crafted to preserve a beauty that refuses to modernize. In that moment, Kyoto becomes both past and present, dream and reality. It is performance as preservation, illusion reborn as identity. But behind the beauty lingers a haunting silence. The geisha houses are fewer now, the apprentices rarer. Many young women see the life as a gilded cage, its demands too rigid for the modern age. And yet, those who remain continue their work with quiet pride, knowing that they are the final guardians of a centuries-old language, one spoken through elegance, restraint, and grace. The floating world, once an escape from duty, now survives as an act of devotion. Where courtesans once sold dreams, geisha now sell remembrance of a time when art and emotion existed in perfect balance. Kyoto itself seems to protect this memory, refusing to let the neon of the new century fully erase its shadows. And so the illusion endures, not as deception, but as truth preserved in silk and song. The pleasure quarters of Kyoto may have vanished in form, but their echo lingers, a soft, eternal whisper reminding Japan that even the most fleeting beauty can outlast time.